You are disgusting, lazy, and clumsy. Pick those pieces up and get out of here!
Please forgive me, ma'am.
The hallway smelled like citrus and cruelty. Warm light spilled through the tall glass panels framing the front door of the Whitmore estate, catching the shimmer of waxed marble and casting soft halos over the intricate crown molding. Everything looked perfect from the outside. The towering hedges, the glint of silver fixtures, the quiet hum of central air. But inside, the walls carried tension. Unspoken. Carefully polished. Just like everything else. Naomi Brooks arrived at 6:55 a.m. every day, never 7:01. She wore her uniform pressed and clean, a pale blue dress, crisp collar, white buttons, white apron. Her shoes were practical, black-soled, and soundless on the floors. She carried no perfume, no jewelry, and never used her phone inside the house unless she was on break. In her tote bag were 3 things: her ID, a small container of lip balm, and a folded picture of her son, Miles. She stepped into the foyer and was greeted by silence, but not the kind that invited peace. This silence watched, recorded, and then, like clockwork, came the voice. "You're late." Naomi paused by the coat rack, turned slowly. "Good morning, ma'am," she said softly. Evelyn Whitmore stood at the top of the stairs, draped in a silk robe the color of dry wine. Blonde hair curled flawlessly over her shoulder. Even this early, her lips were lacquered in rose, eyes outlined in the kind of makeup Naomi couldn't name but recognized from the magazines in the salon. Her stare was cold, but her voice was colder. "I said you're late." "It's 6:55, ma'am." Evelyn smiled, but it was the kind of smile that soured. "I suppose punctuality means different things in different neighborhoods." Naomi's fingers curled tightly around her bag strap, but she said nothing. She never did. She bowed her head slightly, stepped out of her shoes, and moved toward the kitchen. Evelyn descended the stairs slowly, each heel click deliberate. "Don't forget the espresso machine today. Jonathan's investor friends are coming tomorrow, and you know how particular they can be." "Yes, ma'am. And please, for God's sake, don't burn the lemons again. The scent lingers." Naomi nodded and stepped into the kitchen, letting the door swing gently behind her. The scent of roasted coffee beans lingered from the night before, mixing with the faint bleach she'd used on the counters. She took a deep breath and set her bag down beneath the island counter. Outside the window, the trees rustled, branches casting slow-moving shadows on the tiled floor. Naomi wiped down the counter, set the kettle to boil, and opened the pantry to begin inventory. Her movements were silent, rehearsed, a routine that required no thought, only obedience. But today, something felt taut, like a string pulled too tight. At 8:03 a.m., Evelyn appeared again, this time dressed. Gold jewelry dangled from her wrist. Her heels clicked across the marble. "There's lint on the cushion in the sunroom." Naomi didn't ask which one. She just rinsed her hands, dried them on her apron, and walked through the corridor to the sunroom, where a single strand of black thread sat on the ivory cushion like a planted seed. She picked it up. Barely the length of a fingernail. Still, Evelyn's voice cut through. "Do you think this place is your auntie's living room? Because I can assure you, Naomi, that's not the standard we expect here." Naomi turned slowly. Her voice remained calm. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It won't happen again." Evelyn stepped forward, arms folded. "You know, I have to wonder if you even like this job. Or are you just coasting along, doing the bare minimum for a paycheck?" "I work hard, ma'am." "Oh, I don't doubt that you think you do," Evelyn said, voice like frost. "But working hard doesn't mean doing it right." Naomi looked her directly in the eye for the first time that morning. "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn blinked. For a moment, her lips parted like she wanted to say more, something sharper, something final, but the sound of a door closing upstairs drew her attention. Jonathan Whitmore was home. That was unusual. Naomi continued her duties in silence, but her ears stayed alert. She could hear murmurs upstairs. A phone call. Then a thump, something like a drawer closing too hard. Naomi didn't know much about the man of the house except that he was older, polite in passing, and barely around. She had never spoken more than 6 words to him in total. "Thank you, Miss Brooks," was the only phrase he ever offered. By noon, Naomi was back in the laundry room folding bedsheets. Evelyn stood in the hallway with her phone in hand, speaking too loudly about someone's Botox disaster and cackling in a way that didn't match the topic. Naomi kept her focus on the folds. Even. Precise. A shadow passed behind her. "Jonathan." He paused in the doorway, glanced toward Naomi. Their eyes met for a split second, just long enough for him to nod slightly. "Good afternoon," he said. Naomi straightened. "Good afternoon, sir." He looked at her longer than usual, then turned to his wife, still cackling by the staircase. "Evelyn, a word please." Naomi didn't watch. She didn't have to. The silence that followed told her everything. Later that afternoon, Evelyn returned to the kitchen, holding one of the glass tumblers. She set it on the counter harder than necessary, making a sharp clink echo off the tiles. "You cleaned the bar shelf yesterday?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then why is there a water spot on this?" Naomi took the glass gently, examined it under the light. "Barely visible. I'll polish them again." Evelyn didn't leave. Her gaze lingered, loaded. "I hope you understand, Naomi," she said slowly, "that just because my husband is in the house doesn't mean anything changes. I'm the one who hired you. I'm the one who decides who stays." Naomi met her eyes again. But this time, her expression didn't fold. It didn't frown. It didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am," she said again, but something about the tone was different. Firmer. Anchored. And Evelyn noticed. By 6 p.m., Naomi was packing up. Her tote bag was zipped, her apron folded neatly inside. She stepped into her shoes, grabbed the doorknob, then paused. Upstairs, a door creaked. A man's voice, Jonathan's, spoke in a low, stern tone. A woman's voice replied. Not laughter. Not command. Just silence, and then a broken sob. Naomi stepped outside without a word. But the first thread had been pulled. And soon, the whole house would unravel. The next morning, the house felt different. Not quieter, just heavier. As if the walls had inhaled something they didn't know how to exhale. Naomi Brooks arrived exactly at 6:55 a.m. Her shoes landed gently on the welcome mat. She paused before opening the door, taking a moment to brace herself. The doorknob was cold. The air inside colder. No greeting, no click of heels. Just the muffled hum of a blender somewhere deep in the kitchen and the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer. She walked in and moved with purpose, placing her bag in the pantry corner, washing her hands, wiping down the island before anyone noticed she was there. As she opened the fridge to check the vegetable tray, she heard a door creak upstairs. Her pulse didn't quicken, but she noticed it. A minute later, Evelyn entered the kitchen. She wore a tailored black blouse tucked into gray slacks. Her makeup was minimal. Her heels were missing. Bare feet. That was new. Naomi kept her eyes on the cutting board as she sliced lemons with practiced ease. I need the parlor dusted, Evelyn said, voice quiet. Almost too quiet. And the mirrored console near the dining room, it smudged. Naomi nodded. I'll get to it right after breakfast, ma'am. There was a pause. Also, Jonathan will be working from home today. Naomi didn't look up. She simply nodded again and resumed slicing. The rhythm of her knife filled the silence. Evelyn stood there longer than necessary, as if expecting something more. When she didn't get it, she left. For the next hour, Naomi worked methodically, polishing the mirrored console, dusting the parlor, scrubbing the baseboards by hand. Everything she did was precise. Not rushed, not exaggerated. Just careful. She heard Jonathan's voice once, deep, steady, giving instructions over the phone from the upstairs study. He didn't come down for breakfast. By 10 a.m., Naomi was in the East Wing, folding linen on the antique table in the hallway. That was when Evelyn reappeared, this time holding a guest towel by its corner. This is not the fold I asked for, she said sharply. Naomi looked down at the towel in her hand, then back at Evelyn's. They were folded the same. Yes, ma'am. That's the tri-fold just as you requested yesterday. Evelyn walked closer, holding the towel higher like it was a piece of evidence. Don't get clever. Just fix it. Naomi took the towel gently. Of course. But Evelyn didn't let go immediately. Their fingers brushed. You've been walking around here like you own the place lately, Evelyn said. Don't mistake my tolerance for approval. Naomi's voice was steady. I haven't mistaken anything, ma'am. For the first time, Evelyn's eyes wavered. She let go of the towel, turned sharply, and walked down the hallway. But Naomi caught it, the hesitation in her step, the way her fingers twitched slightly at her side. The mask was slipping. By noon, Naomi was preparing lunch when Jonathan finally came downstairs. He wore a navy sweater over a white button-down, his wedding band glinting as he reached for a glass of water. Naomi noticed him pause by the espresso machine. His eyes scanned the countertop. Then he turned to her. You reorganized the drawers? Yes, sir. I labeled the spice jars as well. His eyebrows raised slightly, not with irritation, but something closer to respect. Appreciate that. Of course, sir. He started to walk away, then stopped. How long have you been working here now? Almost 7 months. He nodded slowly. Seems longer. You run the house better than the last 3 combined. Naomi didn't answer. She wouldn't say that, he added. Still, Naomi said nothing. She simply wiped the counter, wrung the cloth dry, and folded it neatly beside the sink. Jonathan watched her for another moment, then left. By mid-afternoon, tension returned. Evelyn was in the sitting room, rearranging a vase that didn't need adjusting. Her phone was in her hand, but she wasn't scrolling. She was waiting. When Naomi entered with the vacuum, Evelyn turned abruptly. Is it too much to ask for quiet when I'm thinking? Naomi turned off the machine. I can come back later. Evelyn stared at her. You're clever, aren't you? No, just careful. Evelyn stepped closer. Is that what this is? The performance? Quiet obedience so my husband thinks you're a saint. Naomi didn't move. I'm here to do my job, ma'am. And what exactly do you think that job is? Naomi met her eyes, calm and firm. To make this house run. To make it feel like someone cares how clean the mirrors are, how fresh the towels smell. To make sure the guests never know how cold it can get in here. Evelyn flinched, but only for a second. She recovered with a sharp breath. I won't have you manipulating him. I haven't said a word to him that wasn't work-related. That doesn't mean anything, Evelyn snapped. I've seen women like you. You smile quietly, wait for the wife to fall apart, and then slide in like you were meant to be there all along. Naomi's voice dropped, soft but clear. Some women don't want to replace anyone, ma'am. Some just want to survive. The room went still. Naomi didn't wait for a response. She turned, pushed the vacuum toward the hallway, and left Evelyn standing there with her fists clenched by her sides. That evening, just before sunset, Naomi finished ironing the guest linens and stepped into the back garden for air. The roses were in bloom. Yellow and cream, blooming high and wide like they weren't afraid of being seen. She sat on the edge of the low stone bench and exhaled. For a few minutes, the world was quiet. Then the glass door creaked open behind her. She turned, expecting Evelyn. But it was Jonathan. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking out at the garden like he'd never noticed it before. I didn't know these bloomed this time of year, he said. They started late, Naomi replied. Cold spring. He nodded, then glanced at her. She's not easy. Naomi didn't respond. But you handle her better than anyone I've seen. Does it ever get to you? He asked. The way she talks to you? Naomi's eyes settled on a pale rose near the hedge. It got to me the first week. Then I realized some people speak cruelly not because of who's in front of them, but because of who's in their own mirror. Jonathan looked at her long and hard. Then quietly said, Thank you. Naomi stood. Enjoy the evening, sir. She walked back inside, slow and steady. And behind her, Jonathan remained, alone in the fading sun, with more questions than he'd had in months. The cracks were no longer invisible. And soon, they'd become impossible to ignore. The following week arrived with unexpected rain. The storm began just after dawn, soft at first, like a whisper against the rooftop, then heavier, persistent, until gutters overflowed and the windows moaned under the weight. Inside the Whitmore house, the chandelier flickered once. Naomi Brooks had already arrived, coat damp, scarf tucked neatly into her bag, apron pressed beneath her trench coat. She removed her shoes at the door like always, placed them beside the umbrella stand, and stepped onto the polished floor as if it might collapse beneath her. The house was unusually still. No classical music playing in the study. No heels clattering across the upstairs landing. No to-do list barked from the staircase. Even the air felt different. Less biting, more uncertain. She wiped down the marble counter, filled the kettle, and checked the fruit bowl for bruised pears. She'd just finished polishing the silverware drawer when Evelyn Whitmore finally appeared, wearing a satin robe she hadn't changed out of since the day before. Her hair was still pinned from sleep. Her eyes had shadows beneath them. Naomi turned to greet her, quiet and respectful. "Good morning, ma'am." Evelyn stood there a moment, blinking like she'd forgotten what time it was. "The usual tea?" Evelyn gave the slightest nod, then sat at the kitchen island without a word. Naomi moved deliberately. She steeped the jasmine, poured it into the bone china cup, and set it gently in front of her employer. Evelyn wrapped her fingers around the cup, staring into the steam as though it might hold an answer. Naomi didn't speak again. She left her to sit there in silence. At 9:17 a.m., the doorbell rang. Naomi answered, finding a dry cleaner's delivery boy standing beneath a dripping hood. He handed her a package wrapped in plastic, and she thanked him, signed the receipt, and returned to the main hallway, only to find Evelyn there, watching. "Why didn't you call me?" Evelyn asked, her tone sharper now, though her voice cracked at the end. "I didn't want to disturb you," Naomi replied. "You disturbed me by not asking." Naomi blinked slowly, then offered the package. "Your dresses from last week." Evelyn didn't take them. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away. That afternoon, while Naomi was dusting the upstairs hallway, she heard something strange. Laughter. A child's laugh, brief, distant. A memory. She paused outside the study door and listened again. Nothing. Just the creak of a chair and the faint rustling of papers. Inside the master bedroom, Evelyn was on the floor, pulling at the bottom drawer of her vanity. Something clattered inside. Naomi walked past the room and caught the moment in a glance. Her boss hunched on the carpet, mascara streaked beneath one eye, a wine glass half full on the windowsill. That wasn't part of the routine. Evelyn didn't drink before 4. She didn't sit on floors. She didn't forget to close doors behind her. Naomi moved on. By 3 p.m., the clouds had broken and sunlight poured into the dining room windows. Naomi stood at the far end of the table, polishing the candelabras when Jonathan entered, briefcase in hand, blazer damp from the rain. He looked toward the staircase, then back at Naomi. "She all right today?" Naomi hesitated, unsure whether the question was genuine or a test. "She's tired, sir." Jonathan exhaled through his nose, like the truth tasted bitter. "She's not sleeping well." Naomi nodded. "She's never liked the rain," he added, half to himself. Then he gave her a tired smile. "The house looks beautiful." "Thank you. You always make it feel better in here." Naomi folded her cloth carefully and placed it on the tray. "Just doing my job, sir." But Jonathan lingered. His eyes scanned the room, not in inspection, but reflection. He was seeing something he hadn't noticed in a long time. Perhaps he wasn't the only one. That evening, Evelyn was missing from dinner. Naomi plated her food regardless. Salmon with lemon rice, grilled asparagus, a small slice of warm bread, and carried it upstairs. She knocked lightly. No answer. She waited, then knocked again. A faint voice came from within. "Leave it outside." Naomi obeyed, setting the tray gently on the hallway bench. As she turned to leave, the door cracked open an inch. Evelyn peeked through, eyes swollen. "I heard what you said." Naomi stopped but didn't turn. "What I said?" "Yesterday. To Jonathan. About people speaking cruelly because of their own mirror." Naomi turned now, slowly. "I didn't mean it as an insult." Evelyn's lips trembled. It wasn't one. They stood there in a silence that felt fragile, like a thread stretched between them. "I don't know why I'm like this," Evelyn whispered, But every time I try to be softer, it feels like weakness. Naomi's voice was low, calm. It's not weakness to stop bleeding on people who didn't cut you. Evelyn's face crumpled for just a moment before the door closed again, soft and slow. Naomi stood there for a second longer, then descended the stairs. As she reached the bottom step, she saw Jonathan in the sitting room, half turned in his chair, eyes fixed on the top landing. He'd heard everything. And this time, he didn't look away. That night, Naomi returned home to find Miles asleep on the couch, cartoons flickering on mute, a blanket half falling from his shoulder. She kissed his cheek, pulled the blanket up, and sat on the floor beside him. She didn't cry. She just stared at the ceiling, breathing in the silence, letting the emotional weight of the day settle across her shoulders like an invisible shawl. In a house built on old money, where kindness had been replaced with performance, and presence mistaken for power, something had shifted. Not loudly, not publicly, but from the inside. And in the days to come, those shifts would become undeniable. Rain gave way to fog the next morning. It crept through the garden like an uninvited guest, smothering the hedges and hanging low beneath the porch eaves. The entire Whitmore house looked suspended in breathless stillness. Naomi arrived just before 7 a.m., umbrella dripping, coat damp at the hem, her fingers red from the morning chill. She didn't knock. She never had to. Inside, the heat had already been turned on. The baseboards clicked softly as they warmed, and the smell of cinnamon from the potpourri upstairs curled faintly through the vents. Naomi moved with the same quiet confidence she always did, hanging her coat, checking the kitchen for dishes, placing a fresh cloth over the fruit basket, folding the edge with care. Evelyn had not come down. That alone wasn't strange. Some mornings she lingered upstairs, especially after long nights when her nerves frayed just past the point of sleep. But the silence now carried a different weight. Not fatigue, avoidance. Naomi continued her routine, scrubbing the stovetop, sweeping the pantry floor, preparing the linens for the guest suite. When she entered the hallway near the east wing, she paused. The door was open. Not wide, but enough. It was the only room in the house Naomi had never been asked to clean. Always locked. Always private. A room even Evelyn referred to vaguely as storage, and Jonathan never spoke of it all. Naomi had walked past it hundreds of times, always catching the scent of old wood and lemon polish through the cracks in the frame. Today, the latch hadn't caught. Naomi hesitated, her mop paused mid-step. The wood beneath her shoes creaked. She stared at the doorknob for a full 5 seconds before she moved. She didn't push the door open. She waited until the next floorboard clicked. Jonathan's voice came from behind her, calm but direct. "You can go in." Naomi turned. He stood near the stairs, sleeves rolled, collar slightly unbuttoned. His eyes didn't hold accusation, only acknowledgement. She opened the door fully. The room was smaller than she expected, barely larger than a walk-in closet. But it wasn't empty. A wooden rocking chair sat in the corner, draped in a faded quilt. A crib, antique, untouched, rested against the far wall. Dust covered everything in a fine layer of stillness. Above the crib hung a painting of a woman holding a child, both faceless, lost in strokes of muted blue. Naomi didn't speak. Jonathan stepped in behind her. His voice barely lifted above a whisper. She was pregnant once. Naomi turned slightly. A daughter. 24 weeks in. Complications. He walked slowly to the edge of the crib. His hand hovered over the rail but never touched it. She never wanted to talk about it after that. Locked the door the day we got back from the hospital. Said the nursery was bad luck. Naomi's chest felt tight, but she kept her voice even. "I'm sorry, sir." He nodded, staring at the dust on the rocker. She was different after. Meaner, colder. I didn't realize how much until years later. He looked over at Naomi. "You've handled her better than I ever could." Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. She understood the heaviness of grief when it sours into cruelty, when pain is misplaced, when love shrivels into resentment because there's nowhere else for it to go. Jonathan stepped past her and closed the door behind them, locking it once again. They didn't speak as they walked back toward the main hallway. At the landing, Evelyn stood at the top of the stairs. She'd heard everything. Her hair was brushed. Her face bare. She wore no jewelry. Her hands trembled just slightly as they clutched the railing. "I told you never to open that room," she said, voice brittle. Jonathan didn't flinch. It was unlocked. Naomi stood still. "You had no right," Evelyn snapped. Jonathan's gaze didn't leave his wife's. "You kept the door locked like it would erase the past. But it didn't." Evelyn looked at Naomi now, eyes sharp, mouth thin. "You can go." Naomi hesitated. "She stays," Jonathan said. "She's not the problem." Evelyn blinked. And for the first time in a long time, she had no retort. Naomi turned without a word and returned to the kitchen. The rest of the day passed like water under pressure, smooth on the surface but tense beneath. Evelyn remained in her room. Jonathan took calls in the study. Naomi folded towels, cleaned windows, arranged fresh flowers in the sunroom, her hands working faster than her mind could process. By the time evening fell, the house had cooled again. As she turned off the dining room lights, Naomi heard a soft knock against the back door. She opened it to find Mr. Lewis, the elderly gardener, soaked from the waist down. "Storm took out the rose trellis near the back fence," he said. Naomi grabbed a raincoat from the hook and followed him outside. They worked in silence, propping the trellis with spare bricks, tying back the climbing vines. The rain had left the soil heavy. Naomi's gloves were soaked, her sleeves muddy. She didn't mind. When she came back inside, her apron stained and fingers stiff, she found Evelyn in the kitchen. She stood near the island, holding a glass of water, eyes distant. Naomi paused. Evelyn looked up. "Did you know I used to be kind?" she asked suddenly. Naomi said nothing. "I used to bake for the neighbors. I knew the names of everyone at church. I remembered birthdays." She placed the glass down, the rim clicking against the granite. "I was gentle once. Before I learned gentleness doesn't protect you." Naomi stepped forward, unbuttoning her raincoat. "Maybe it doesn't protect," she said softly. "But it's the only thing that heals." Evelyn stared at her, face unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Naomi stood there, soaked and silent, as the house swallowed the echoes of Evelyn's footsteps. Upstairs, Jonathan closed the door to the nursery for the final time. Outside, the fog thickened again. Inside, something had shifted once more. The cracks weren't just in the walls. They were in the people. And once they appeared, there was no way to pretend they weren't there. It started with a mirror. Not the tall beveled one in the grand hallway, or the ornate gilded oval in Evelyn's room. This mirror was small, square, plain, and nailed crooked above the laundry sink in the back service quarters where Naomi folded clothes every Wednesday. That afternoon, as she was pressing one of Jonathan's shirts, she looked up. Her reflection startled her. The soft bruising beneath her left eye had deepened, unnoticed until then. Not from violence, but from exhaustion. From carrying days that never quite ended and swallowing words no one cared to hear. She touched the darkened skin, then tucked her fingers away and kept ironing. The house had grown quiet again. But this silence wasn't cold. It wasn't tight with tension. It was heavier in a different way, like a body in recovery. Not well, not healed, but no longer pretending the wound didn't exist. Evelyn had stopped speaking to Naomi altogether that week. Not out of anger, there was no yelling, but out of discomfort, as if words now required more strength than she could muster. She passed Naomi in the hallways without the clipped instructions. There were no complaints about towels, no corrections about how to fold linens or arrange centerpieces. She simply moved from room to room like a woman unsure of her place inside her own home. On Friday morning, something changed. Naomi entered the kitchen just before 7 a.m., the smell of warm bread still faint from the oven's previous use. She went about her tasks without urgency, setting the kettle, preparing breakfast trays, tidying the spice drawer. When she opened the cabinet beneath the sink, she saw it. A small cardboard box with no label, tucked behind the extra bleach. Naomi almost ignored it, but something made her reach for it. The weight was strange, light, uneven. She lifted the lid. Inside were 4 items: a folded baby sock, yellowed with age. A faded hospital wristband. A photograph of Evelyn, bare-faced, smiling, clearly pregnant, taken on a bench near a park fountain. And a letter, unopened, addressed to "My daughter, wherever you are." Naomi didn't read it. She placed the items back exactly as she found them, closed the lid, and returned it to the dark beneath the sink. But she didn't move right away. She stayed there, crouched, staring at the edge of the box like it held the root of all the sharpness that had ever been thrown her way. She thought of Evelyn's cold remarks, the calculated humiliations, the long pauses between Jonathan's silences. And she understood. Not because she forgave, but because she recognized the kind of ache that has nowhere to go. Later that day, as she arranged the guest towels on the upstairs rack, she heard Evelyn's door open. Slow steps down the hallway. Then, Evelyn's voice, bare, unarmored. "Did you go through my things?" Naomi turned. She didn't lie. Yes. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She stood at the edge of the hallway, shoulders drawn in like a woman bracing for impact. "Why?" Naomi's answer came without force. "Because I wanted to understand why you've spent 7 months trying to erase me." Evelyn blinked slowly. "I wasn't trying to erase you," she said, voice thin. "I was trying to make you leave before you saw too much." Naomi folded the last towel and placed it down. "I've already seen too much," she said quietly. "Not just from you. From the world." They stood in silence. The hallway light flickered above them. "I was 29, Evelyn said finally. "It happened in July. There was blood everywhere. The doctor didn't make it in time." Naomi didn't speak. She simply stood still and listened. She was small. Could have fit in one hand. I didn't even hold her. I was too scared of what I might feel. Evelyn's hands trembled at her sides. "Jonathan cried more than I did," she continued. "He named her Grace. Said she was the only part of us that would have been good." Her voice cracked on that last word. Naomi stepped forward slightly. Not close enough to touch. Just enough to remain present. Evelyn looked away. "I wasn't angry at you. I was angry that you weren't me. That you still had hope in your eyes." Naomi's breath caught. "I don't," she said. "I just wear it better." That night, Jonathan sat on the back porch with a glass of scotch, his wedding ring spinning slowly between his fingers. Naomi brought him a folded blanket. He looked at her and smiled, grateful. "She's changing," he said. Naomi shook her head once. "She's remembering." "Is that enough?" "It's a start." Inside, Evelyn stood at the foot of the crib in the locked room. She had unlocked it herself that morning. No ceremony, no announcement. She placed a white daisy on the edge of the rail and whispered something Naomi would never hear. The next morning, Evelyn entered the kitchen before sunrise. She found Naomi already there, whisking eggs in a glass bowl. Without speaking, Evelyn picked up a second bowl and started peeling potatoes. Her movements were clumsy, but she didn't stop. Naomi handed her a sharper peeler. They worked in tandem, side by side. No instructions, no orders. For the first time since Naomi had walked through the front door of that mansion, they felt like two women sharing something instead of surviving one another. At 9:05 a.m., Jonathan stepped into the kitchen and stopped. He watched as his wife and Naomi moved quietly, measuring flour, heating pans, plating toast. It was the smallest thing, but in that moment, it felt like a revolution. Evelyn poured Naomi a cup of tea and set it in front of her. "Thank you," she said softly. Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she took it. "You just did." Outside, the fog lifted for the first time in days. Inside, the house exhaled. And for once, the silence wasn't heavy. It was holy. The dining room smelled of fresh tulips and wood polish. A soft breeze stirred the gauze curtains just enough to make the place feel alive. Naomi stood by the long walnut table, adjusting the cutlery for lunch even though she'd already said it once. She wasn't nervous. Not exactly. But something had been shifting over the past few days. Not just in Evelyn's tone or Jonathan's gaze. It was in the corners of the house, in how light now stayed longer in rooms that used to feel cold by noon. Still, something in the house remained out of place. She felt it more than she could explain. As she laid the final spoon down, she heard Evelyn's voice from the entryway. "Naomi, could you help me with something outside?" She turned. Evelyn wore a wide straw hat, gardening gloves in one hand and a trowel in the other. Her eyes looked brighter, not from makeup, but from something softer, humility, maybe. They stepped outside together. The garden was blooming wildly, hydrangeas, peonies, and ivy curling along the wrought iron fence. Evelyn led Naomi to the far end, near the old bench beneath the birch trees. "I was thinking about planting something here," she said, motioning to a patch of bare soil. "Something permanent." Naomi waited. Evelyn crouched beside the bench and started pulling weeds, but her hands paused over the soil. "My mother used to keep white lilies in our front yard," she said. "I used to think they looked like they were praying." Naomi knelt beside her, pulling on a stubborn root. "Maybe it's time to start over," Evelyn added, brushing dirt from her knees. "From where?" Naomi asked gently. "From the parts one kept buried." For a while, they worked in silence, just the rustle of leaves, the soft scrape of metal against earth. Evelyn's hands were clumsy with the trowel, but she didn't complain. Naomi offered her a small shovel instead and watched her press it into the dirt with more confidence. When they finished, Evelyn stood and wiped her forehead with the back of her glove. "I'll get some lilies tomorrow." Naomi nodded. "They'll need morning light." Evelyn looked up at the sky, shielding her eyes with one hand. "Then I guess I'll have to wake up early." That afternoon, the house stayed quiet. Jonathan was still at the office. Naomi had finished folding the linens and was moving toward the sunroom to sweep when she noticed the small glass jar sitting on the console table. It hadn't been there that morning. She picked it up. Inside was a slip of paper. She pulled it out carefully. It wasn't written in Evelyn's handwriting. It was Jonathan's. The note read simply, "She doesn't know I kept it. I didn't think she'd survive if she read it." Naomi's heart paused in her chest. She looked back at the jar. At the folded paper inside. A second, sealed envelope. Her fingers trembled. She left it on the table and turned toward the office. Jonathan wasn't due home until later. But the door to his study was cracked. Naomi hesitated. She stepped inside. The room was dim. Mahogany shelves lined with law books. Certificates. A grandfather clock ticking slowly. She had dusted every inch of this room a dozen times, but now, it felt unfamiliar. Heavier. On his desk sat a stack of mail and a crystal tumbler half full of scotch. She didn't touch anything. But something caught her eye, a leather binder beside the bookshelf, partially pulled out from its case. Its spine was labeled, Trusts and Holdings, Grace Evelyn Whitmore. Naomi opened it. Inside were documents spanning nearly 8 years. A trust fund. A list of annual deposits. Statements detailing investments and charities. At the back was a single note, stapled to a legal letterhead. Funds allocated in child's name for medical support. Confidentiality requested. There was no recipient listed. But the numbers, they matched the ones Naomi had seen on the scholarship forms Evelyn filed just days ago. Her breath caught. Evelyn didn't start that fund last week. It had existed for years. And it wasn't Evelyn who created it. Naomi stepped back, heart pounding. She left the binder untouched, exactly as it was, and returned to the hallway where the jar still sat on the table. She reached for the envelope again, then stopped. The front was blank. She held it up to the light. Inside, a name was faintly visible, etched by the pressure of ink long faded. Naomi Brooks. A key dropped somewhere upstairs. She turned sharply, hands still trembling. Evelyn appeared on the landing. Their eyes locked. Evelyn's gaze dropped to the envelope. Her face drained of color. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said, voice thin. Naomi placed the envelope down slowly. "What is it?" Evelyn came down the steps, her fingers clutched tightly around the railing. "That letter. I wrote it a year ago. After your first month here." Naomi's breath caught. "I was going to fire you," Evelyn said. "You were too calm. Too good. I couldn't understand how someone like you could keep showing up with grace, even when I treated you like a ghost." Naomi said nothing. "I didn't send it," Evelyn added. "Jonathan said I didn't deserve to." Naomi's voice broke the silence. What was in it? Evelyn looked away. A confession. An apology. And a recommendation letter for a job that would have paid you better than this one. Naomi stared. You wanted me to leave, she said flatly. I wanted to set you free before I broke you. Naomi turned away, but Evelyn stepped forward. I didn't know how to say sorry and mean it, she whispered. I only knew how to hurt before I could be hurt. Outside, wind rustled the trees. A single leaf scraped against the window pane like it, too, was trying to say something it had buried too long. I stayed, Naomi said softly. Not because I couldn't leave, but because I knew you needed someone who saw you and didn't flinch. Evelyn looked at her, tears brimming in her eyes. I see you now, she whispered. Naomi's jaw tightened. I hope you never stop. They stood there in silence. Then, Naomi picked up the envelope, placed it gently back inside the jar, and returned it to the table. Some things didn't need to be read to be understood. They only needed to be carried forward. Jonathan stood beneath the porch light long after Naomi and Evelyn had gone back inside. He didn't light the cigar in his hand. He only held it, letting the cedar aroma mix with the dew settling across the garden. Something had shifted in the house. He felt it before he understood it. The way footsteps softened. The way Evelyn's voice lingered in the kitchen longer than it used to. The way Naomi, despite the exhaustion she carried like a second skin, moved with presence instead of pretense. But none of that explained what he had found in the desk drawer that morning. A folded letter. One he hadn't written. One that bore Naomi's name, but wasn't addressed to her. Not directly. He read it once. Then twice. The language was sharp, defensive. Apologetic in posture but not in spirit. The letter accused Naomi of disrupting the household dynamic, of concerning shifts in Jonathan's attention, and of emotional manipulation disguised as professionalism. It was dated 4 months ago. Signed by Evelyn. But never sent. He knew Evelyn could be cruel when cornered. But this wasn't cruelty. It was fear. He closed the drawer and left the study without a word. But something inside him had started to uncoil. A question that, once asked, could not be silenced. What else had Evelyn been hiding? The next morning, he found Naomi in the back garden, pulling dead leaves from the flower beds. Do you have a minute? He asked, voice low. Naomi stood, brushing soil from her gloves. Of course. He hesitated, searching her face. Did she ever ask you to leave? Naomi looked at him, eyes steady. Not in words. But yes. Jonathan exhaled slowly. She wrote you a letter, he said. Naomi nodded. I found it yesterday. She saw me holding it. He folded his arms, gaze drifting toward the house. She said it was because she was afraid she'd ruin you. Naomi didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked out over the garden, where the lilies they had planted days ago were beginning to bloom, pale green shoots piercing the earth with delicate certainty. I think she meant it, she said finally, even if she didn't understand why. Jonathan ran a hand over his jaw. Did she ever accuse me? Of being too familiar? Naomi's eyebrows lifted. No. He gave a slow, uncertain nod. She once told a therapist she thought I pitied her. That when I looked at her, I saw a damaged woman I couldn't fix. Naomi tilted her head. Did you? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked slowly toward the fence, where the wind had knocked over one of the ceramic planters. He righted it gently, as if correcting something he could never admit aloud. Inside the house, Evelyn stood at the window. She had seen them talking. She had seen the way Jonathan's body leaned slightly toward Naomi. She had seen the stillness in Naomi's stance. And for a flicker of a moment, it stabbed her again. Not jealousy but recognition. Recognition that her fear was no longer in control. That Naomi hadn't come to ruin her, but to reveal her. That all the polished silverware and monogrammed napkins and elaborate place settings meant nothing when a stranger could come in and love your house better than you ever did. She sat down at the edge of her bed and reached for the drawer in her nightstand. Inside was a photo. It had fallen behind the dividers and wedged itself against the velvet lining weeks ago. It was from their anniversary in Vermont, 10 years ago. Evelyn wore a green dress, hair pinned back, a smile wide enough to break something. Jonathan stood beside her, holding her hand with both of his. Back then, she believed they were unshakable. Now, she wasn't sure if they had ever truly been anything but fragile. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Naomi stayed late to polish the floors. Evelyn came down barefoot, holding a tray with 2 cups of tea. "Caffeine-free," she said awkwardly, setting it down. "I remember you mentioned it once." Naomi blinked, surprised, but sat down and accepted the cup. They sipped in silence. Evelyn shifted in her seat. "I wrote another letter." Naomi looked up. "Not like before," Evelyn said quickly. "This one wasn't meant to be hidden." She reached into her cardigan pocket and handed Naomi the envelope. Naomi unfolded it and read in silence. When she finished, she didn't speak. Evelyn stared at her hands. "It says what I wish I had said back then," she murmured. "But I don't expect you to believe it all. I just needed to say it out loud." Naomi folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "Thank you," she said softly. Evelyn's shoulders dropped slightly, as if she'd exhaled something that had been sitting on her ribs for years. Jonathan entered the room minutes later, pausing at the doorway. He saw them sitting together, no distance, no tension. Just 2 women drinking tea in the quiet. He cleared his throat. "Naomi, could I borrow you for a second?" She rose. They stepped into the hall. Jonathan's expression was unreadable. "I know it's not my place," he said, voice hushed. "But you've done something here that no therapist or family member ever managed." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You stayed." She met his gaze. "I stayed because I knew someone needed me to." He nodded, then hesitated. "I also found something yesterday," he added. "A draft of a new will." Naomi stiffened. "She listed you. By name. Not just in the household account. In the inheritance section." Naomi's heart dropped. "I didn't ask for that." "I know. That's why she's doing it." He looked toward the living room, where Evelyn now sat alone, sipping the last of the tea. She's finally realizing that love isn't about control. It's about presence. Naomi didn't speak, but something flickered in her expression. A soft release. A quiet forgiveness. A sense that the worst part might finally be behind them. Rain tapped against the windows that morning with the soft insistence of memory. The Whitmore estate, usually flooded with golden light by 9, sat in a quiet hush, as if holding its breath. Naomi stood in the hallway, polishing the mahogany banister with slow, deliberate strokes. Her motions were steady, but inside her chest, something shifted, like a tide pulling back after months of swelling. Upstairs, Evelyn sat at her vanity, eyes locked on the reflection in the mirror. Her face was bare. No foundation to mask the tired lines under her eyes. No lipstick to paint courage over regret. She was no longer hiding from what she had become. She had written Naomi's name into the new will the night before. Not because of guilt. Not out of pity. But because, for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be held up, not by people who wanted something from her, but by someone who gave, even when it cost everything. There was a knock at the door. Jonathan entered, hair damp from the rain, umbrella in one hand. "Naomi," he called gently from the foyer. "Can I speak to you before I head out?" She met him at the foot of the stairs. "I wanted to tell you in person," he said, slipping a thin file into her hand. "This is from our attorney." Naomi opened the file slowly. Inside was a formal letter confirming her name had been added to the estate's educational trust. The amount listed beneath made her breath catch. "For Jamal?" she whispered. "For Jamal," Jonathan confirmed. "And any other child in this city who needs what your son almost didn't get." She clutched the folder to her chest. "There's more," Jonathan said, reaching into his briefcase. "This," he held up a folded letter, "is from Evelyn. The public letter. She's sending it to the Foundation's board. She's naming you co-founder of the Whitmore Brooks initiative." Naomi blinked. "You're putting my name on it?" She insisted. A beat passed. "I am only a maid who clean your house," she said quietly. Jonathan shook his head. You taught us how to clean our lives. From the top of the stairs, Evelyn watched. She didn't step forward. She didn't interrupt. But for the first time, she felt no fear in letting Naomi be seen. Later that day, as Naomi packed up to leave, Evelyn stood by the front door holding a small velvet box. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a brooch, shaped like a lily, with a single pearl in the center. It belonged to my grandmother, Evelyn said. She gave it to me the day I got married. I wore it thinking it would make me feel worthy. But I always felt like an imposter. Naomi hesitated. I want you to have it, Evelyn added, because you remind me that worth isn't worn. It's earned. And you earned more than this house could ever pay. Naomi didn't reach for the brooch. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped Evelyn in a quiet embrace. They stood there for a long moment, two women stitched together by pain, grace, and the slow work of healing. Weeks passed. The house changed in subtle ways. Fresh flowers appeared in places Evelyn used to ignore. The staff laughed more. The air felt lighter, no longer soaked in tension or judgment. Even the dog, Duke, who once never left Jonathan's side, had taken to curling beside Naomi's mop bucket in the afternoons. But the real shift came the day Naomi brought Jamal to visit. He was shy at first, hiding behind her legs. Evelyn bent down slowly, hands resting on her knees. Hi, Jamal. I've heard a lot about you. He peeked up at her, wide-eyed and curious. She held out a small toy train. Your mom told me you liked these. He stepped forward cautiously, took it, and turned the wheels between his fingers. Later, they sat in the sunroom, Evelyn, Naomi, Jamal, and Jonathan, watching the boy line up his toy cars on the windowsill. It was quiet. Jonathan sipped his tea and looked at Naomi. You know, he said, when I first hired you, Evelyn told me it wouldn't work. She said you'd last a week. Naomi chuckled. She wasn't wrong. I almost left. What made you stay? She looked toward the window where Jamal pressed his face against the glass, watching raindrops race each other to the bottom. I couldn't let his future be shaped by someone else's fear. Jonathan nodded. I'm glad you didn't. As the evening dimmed, Naomi gathered her things to leave. Evelyn walked her to the door. You'll be back tomorrow? She asked. Same time as always. Evelyn smiled faintly. Good. Naomi paused. You're doing better. Evelyn's smile didn't waver. Only because someone stayed long enough to see the worst of me and didn't run. Naomi turned to leave. At the gate, she looked back one last time. The house glowed in the dusk, not just from the lights inside, but from the kind of warmth that only shows up after the storm has passed. As Naomi stepped into the quiet street, a stranger passing by might have seen only a woman in a plain coat carrying a tote bag and a plastic lunchbox. But inside that house, behind every polished floorboard and folded napkin, was the story of someone who refused to break. Someone who loved without being asked. Who endured without needing applause. And in doing so, changed an entire home. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet battles we fight behind closed doors, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who's ever been overlooked. Someone who's ever carried the weight of being kind in a world that made it hard. Click that like button, not just for the story, but for the strength it represents. For every person who chose patience over pride, dignity over revenge, love over leaving. And if you're not already part of this community, now is the time. Subscribe to join us in telling stories that don't just entertain, but speak to something real. Stories that bring light to the places silence used to live. Before you go, tell us in the comments, has someone ever seen the strength in you before you could name it yourself? We'd love to hear your story. Until next time, take care of each other. Be the quiet change. And keep watching.